May 1945. The guns fell silent, and Europe cheered. But in the ruined streets of Warsaw and Krakow, another sound rose, the boots of a new occupier. One American commander watched what diplomats refused to see, and in the quiet of his maps he wrote a plan that could have changed history. This is the story of General George S. Patton, the soldier who urged his nation to move east, the warning Dwight Eisenhower would not heed, and the buried ideas that historians now call unthinkable.
VE Day splashed the headlines, but for frontline commanders, the war's end brought something darker. The red carpet of Soviet control rolling across Eastern Europe. Between May 8 and May 20, Patton moved through cities where cheers blended with fear. Liaison officers brought reports of arbitrary arrests, summary expulsions, and forced requisitions, not isolated incidents, but a pattern. Patton watched Soviet columns take position where governments should be formed, and his field reports took on the urgency of a man who believed military possession would become political mandate. In terse, blunt notes, he told Eisenhower, "Where their bayonets rest, their system will stand." For Patton, it was simple operational logic. Control the ground, and you shape the peace. For the politicians in Paris and Washington, it was a harder arithmetic. Coalition politics, public fatigue, and the desperate need to convert victory into order without reigniting war. The friction between a soldier's immediate fix and a diplomat's long gamble would set the stage for the sharpest post-war argument the Allies ever had.
Patton's case wasn't rhetoric. It was a timed military argument. He told Eisenhower that in late May 1945, the Red Army was exhausted from its spring offensives, its supply lines long, and its divisions stretched thin across newly captured cities. American armored and mechanized units, by contrast, were concentrated, fueled, and eager. Patton sketched an operational pathway to the Vistula, a rapid, limited advance to seize key rail hubs and river crossings before Soviet forces could entrench. He insisted this was not conquest, but containment. Deny Moscow the prizes that would give it political leverage over Poland and Central Europe. In staff meetings, he pointed to maps, logistics reports, and intercepted communications, arguing for tempo and decisive movement. Eisenhower's refusal was not ignorance, it was a calculation. Opening a hot conflict with Moscow risked destroying an Allied coalition and inviting a new, catastrophic war. Yet to field commanders watching local realities, the political calculation looked like passivity in the face of creeping occupation. Patton's memos grew sharper, his public remarks more combustible. The gulf between tactical feasibility and strategic prudence widened into bitterness.
Across the Channel, Winston Churchill feared the same tide. In late May and June of 1945, British chiefs drafted a contingency study, later dubbed Operation Unthinkable, an examination of what an Anglo-American push to roll back Soviet gains might require. It was not policy. It was a sober, frightened thought experiment. Churchill's memorandum and Patton's field plans told the same strategic story from different seats. Political leaders could negotiate, but military men saw that possession shaped outcomes. When British planners ran numbers and considered the human cost, they recorded a brutal truth. Any push into Eastern Europe risked opening a war with a giant still swollen with war power. The British study, like Patton's proposals, was quietly shelved. The documentary thread here tightens. Two powerful actors, one in uniform and one in office, staring at the same danger and finding themselves blocked by the same political gravity. For Patton, Churchill's echoes were vindication. For the politicians, they were proof the only way forward was a negotiated order at Potsdam, however imperfect.
Patton's bluntness collided with Eisenhower's caution in the cramped map rooms and ornate staff tents of post-war Europe. In conference after conference, Patton pressed not with rhetoric, but with routes and timetables, rail hubs to seize, river crossings to deny, divisions to thrust in narrow windows of advantage. Eisenhower replied with a statesman's checklist: coalition cohesion, diplomatic pledges made at Yalta and soon Potsdam, and the political cost of firing the first shot at an ally. The tension was personal as well as professional. Patton accused political leaders of naivete. Eisenhower saw a general whose temperament and public remarks risked sabotaging fragile diplomacy. The argument hardened into a simple choice: press a risky military solution now or trust negotiations and face the slow creep of Soviet influence. That choice would shadow the Allied occupation for years.
By summer 1945, Patton's public utterances, his scathing diary lines, his impatience with political niceties, his colorful, sometimes offensive language made him an easy target for newspapers and emerging radio commentators. Headlines that once cheered his battlefield exploits now blinked warnings: hothead, warmonger, unfit for command. Veterans' admiration clashed with editorial alarm. Viewers' online reactions decades later echo the same split. Some call him prescient, others see arrogance. The flip side is vital. Media pressure didn't arise in a vacuum. Washington feared inflammatory rhetoric might inflame an already combustible relationship with Moscow. The press became another lever in a contest where reputations, not just rivers and railways, were at stake, and Patton's reputation, once untouchable, was being methodically eroded.
Patton did not retreat. He turned his field observations into written assessments and recommendations, dispatching reports to Eisenhower and turned copies toward Washington. In these pages, he laid out worst-case political scenarios if Soviet forces retained strategic depth in Poland and the Balkans, and he urged preventative measures that ranged from fortifying lines to coordinated pressure with Britain. High Command read the reports as both tactical notes and political provocations. For policymakers, the reports were difficult. Ignore a frank professional view at their peril, or act and risk instant war with a nuclear-capable ally in waiting. In the months that followed, military options were quietly catalogued, debated, and then shelved. Patton's prose grew sterner, his frustration more public. The gulf between operational clarity and political prudence had hardened into strategic paralysis.
As debates in capitals cooled into policy, Patton's role changed. He was relieved of active command for a mix of reasons: his public comments, diplomatic sensitivity, and the shifting needs of occupation administration, and reassigned to duties that removed him from the front line of policy influence. Rumors and resentment swirled. Critics whispered that politics had sidelined a great soldier. Supporters cried foul and even suggested darker motives. Then, in December 1945, Patton's life ended after an automobile accident on December 9 that left him gravely injured. He died on December 21, 1945. His death closed the most dramatic act in a controversial year, and it left questions that would be debated for decades. Had a soldier been silenced by circumstance, or by natural consequence. The record offers facts. History continues to argue motive. At Potsdam, the great powers gathered to draw the skeleton of post-war Europe: borders, zones, reparations. The conference was a diplomat's world of ink and oath, and its agreements were literal paper walls thrown around contested nations. Patton watched the broadcasts from his HQ and read dispatches that showed Soviet troops already occupying the ground that treaty language would later claim. For military men, the map's ink meant little. For soldiers, possession was everything. Patton's reports to Eisenhower argued that the Allies could still shape the map by repositioning forces while Soviet units were dispersed and fatigued. In Potsdam's halls, however, the calculus was different. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin faced public opinion, domestic politics, and the fragile fabric of alliance. The result was a compromise, peace by negotiation, rather than by the powerful telescoping of armored columns. Patton's warnings thus collided head-on with the prevailing belief among political leaders that peace required restraint, even at the cost of influence in Eastern Europe.
Patton's proposals were not emotional bombast. They read as military doctrine. He emphasized lines of supply, rail nodes at Krakow and Lublin, bridgeheads over the Vistula, and the exploitation of Allied air superiority to disrupt Soviet logistics. His central claim: temporary tactical moves could create durable political leverage. Planners in London and Washington ran counters and concluded bluntly that any push risked driving the alliance into open hostilities. The balance of ground forces favored the Red Army in depth. The British Joint Planning Staff's own math, later published as Operation Unthinkable, quantified that the Allies would face numerical inferiority and logistical strain. In short, the military logic for a rapid push coexisted with a strategic judgment against it, feasible in isolated slices, catastrophic if it escalated. That military paradox, when the map invites action but the wider balance forbids it, lay at the heart of the post-victory dilemma.
By autumn 1945, the press cycle had turned. Patton's blunt diaries, offhand remarks, and blunt ethic of leadership were now sampled by columnists who feared political fallout. Headlines argued that a general openly campaigning for military solutions risked provoking a diplomatic rupture. Supporters countered that Patton's frankness exposed a naivete among certain politicians who mistook conference minutes for control of terrain. The public split into factions: veterans who revered his battlefield genius, and civilian commentators wary of a reckless commander. The result was twofold. His influence in policy councils shrank, and the space for his public advocacy narrowed. That contraction, as much about perception as it was about policy, altered the shape of American military leadership in Europe and helped turn the war's immediate aftermath into a political contest of narratives as well as borders.
Behind the public controversy, staff officers quietly cataloged military options, not for an impulsive offensive, but to ensure that policymakers understood the trade-offs: where to reinforce, which rail hubs to hold, and how to posture air and naval assets to deter further Soviet moves. These were operational volumes, lists of divisions, fuel stocks, rail capacities, designed to be read by secretaries of state and chiefs of staff alike. Yet the repeated conclusion, drawn from sober intelligence and the Joint Planning Staff's assessments, was the same.
Only a surprise, narrow, and audacious action could have altered the map quickly. Otherwise, the great Soviet machine, with its staggering manpower reserves, would grind any protracted Western thrust into a war of attrition. So the options were preserved on paper, debated in closed rooms, and then set aside in favor of diplomacy and occupation administration.
Patton's reassignment to an administrative role, the 15th Army's historical and training duties, removed him from the immediate levers of influence. He was a brilliant combat leader wed to a wartime temperament unsuited to delicate occupation diplomacy. His distance from the front and from policy rooms, coupled with continuing media friction, left him increasingly isolated. Even so, he continued to write and speak privately, convinced that a neglected window of military opportunity had been closed. His critics argued that his temperament made him a political liability. His supporters replied that the polity had chosen a safer path over decisive risk. Then, in December, a freak car accident on a German road put an end to his voice. Patton was injured on December 9th and died of his injuries on December 21, 1945. His death froze an argument that might otherwise have been fought out over years, and turned the debate into a contested memory rather than an open policy struggle.
After Patton's death, the argument he'd led did not disappear. It was transformed into memory, rumor, and policy footnotes. Veterans who served under him circulated tales of a commander who saw beyond treaties. Critics pointed to his temperament, controversies over Task Force bomb, and blunt public remarks as reasons his voice should be muted. In Washington and London, staff papers containing contingency options, the same operational sketches Patton favored, were quietly shelved but preserved, while public conversation turned to reconstruction and the looming question of how to manage millions of displaced persons. For a new generation, Patton became a symbol, either a prophetic hawk who foresaw communist tyranny, or an impulsive general whose rhetoric risked sparking another war. That contested memory would shape Cold War narratives and the way Americans remembered the immediate post-war months.
Patton did not speak from guesswork. Intelligence reports, captured German documents, and liaison accounts painted a worrying picture of Soviet practices in occupied lands. Mass deportations, political purges, and rapid establishment of puppet administrations. Allied intelligence, however, was divided. Tactical intercepts showed Soviet troop dispositions, but strategic understanding of Stalin's political calculus lagged behind. Planners in London and Washington weighed each signal against political risk. The Joint Planning Staff's papers concluded that while Soviet behavior in captured territories was coercive, the practical means to alter outcomes without catastrophic escalation were limited. In short, the evidence existed, but the policy levers available to translate it into action were thin and fraught with peril.
Churchill's fear of Soviet domination was not merely a strategic, it was moral. In private cables and speeches, he argued that Britain and her allies had fought to free nations that now faced subjugation. His prompting of the Joint Planning Staff to think the unthinkable was driven by a conviction that the West owed Poland and Eastern Europe a better fate than the one Stalin's armies threatened to impose.
Yet Churchill also faced electoral politics, resource constraints, and the hard arithmetic of manpower. His insistence produced studies, not declarations, and those studies were later used by historians as evidence that Western leaders debated, however briefly, the costs of acquiescence. The moral case for action collided with the grim ledger of logistics and the desire to avoid a second, incomparably worse war.
In Washington, the choice aggregated into a calculus of politics, risk, and presidential ambition. Truman, newly president, faced domestic pressures, a war-weary public, an urgent need to reconvert industry, and the political hazards of opening a new front against the USSR. Eisenhower, politically ambitious and conscious of coalition bonds, favored restraint. Officials in the State Department and the White House argued that the diplomatic forum, Yalta, Potsdam, and the emerging United Nations offered the path to order. Military adventurism offered only unpredictable catastrophe. The question was stark: accept the limits of negotiation now, or gamble the nation's peace and prestige on a tactical thrust with unknowable consequences. For Patton, the choice represented moral failure. For policymakers, it was the hard management of a fragile peace.
With offensive options suppressed, Western strategy moved from immediate military confrontation to long-term containment. Plans were preserved in classified files, then re-examined as geopolitical competition hardened into the Cold War. The unthinkable offensive faded into contingency papers, while policymakers built alliances, aid programs, and strategic air power to check Soviet expansion without triggering total war. Patton's tactical window may have closed in 1945, but his basic warning that possession of territory would determine political outcomes became a pillar of Cold War strategy. Historians later noted the irony. The West avoided a hot war in 1945, but then spent decades preparing for one in different forms: NATO, Marshall aid, and sustained military posture across Europe.
The hardest scenes to stage are those that never happened. What if a bold push had driven Soviet units back from Warsaw? Would it have saved millions from repression or sparked a continental conflagration? Historians craft counterfactuals with caution. Short, localized successes might have been possible, but the Joint Planning Staff warned the political cost and the manpower math made a long war likely. The true legacy of Patton's warning is not settled in speculative victory or defeat, but in the way his voice forced Allied leaders to confront the trade-offs between immediate action and long-term stability. In the decades that followed, the world learned to live with the consequences of 1945. For some, Patton remains a prophet. For others, a cautionary figure whose impulse for decisive action collided with the grim arithmetic of geopolitics.
With offensive options shelved, Western leaders pivoted. The immediate impulse to push Soviet forces back gave way to a policy of containment. Aid, alliances, and deterrent postures meant to shape influence without triggering a continental war. The Marshall Plan, strategic basing, and diplomatic pressure became the instruments of a new struggle that would unfold over decades. For veterans of the 1945 debates, including some of Patton's former staff, containment felt like an answer to his core warning: accept Soviet influence only reluctantly, and then check its spread by other means. It was less dramatic than a single decisive thrust, but it aimed to preserve long-term Western influence in places where the Red Army could not be expelled by force without catastrophic risk.
Churchill's Joint Planning Staff Report, the so-called Operation Unthinkable, became infamous for its blunt conclusions. A limited surprise attack might be contemplated, but the manpower, math, and Soviet depth made a decisive, quick victory unlikely. The document's stark assessment that any successful rollback risked a protracted war validated the politicians' caution and showed why military flair alone could not resolve Europe's post-war fate. The study lived in classified files for decades, then resurfaced as historians found the paper trail that linked wartime fear with post-war policy choices. For Patton's part, the report read like both confirmation and condemnation. Confirmation that the Western alliance had considered military options, condemnation that political leaders chose restraint.
Much of the post-war argument moved from map rooms into archives. Patton's diaries and memos, now preserved in the Patton papers, show a commander convinced of a moral and military imperative to act, and also reveal his blunt, sometimes incendiary language that alienated civilian leaders. The papers explain why his view carried weight in some quarters and caused alarm in others. They are the private record of a soldier whose vision of peace was secured by steel, not speeches. Over the next decade, scholars and veterans mined both his public statements and private notes to debate whether 1945 represented a lost chance or a narrowly avoided catastrophe. The documents themselves became a central source for the contested story he left behind.
Patton paid a political price for candor. His aggressive public tone and occasional departures from official policy led to relief from active theater command and a reassignment to a staff role that sharply reduced his influence. Military leaders debated whether a field commander's frankness deserved punishment or whether politics had muffled an essential strategic alarm. For younger officers and veterans, the episode underscored a hard lesson. The soldier who speaks truth to power may pay a high cost if the truth threatens the fragile art of diplomacy. It was a bitter irony that a man who had won reputations for decisive action found himself sidelined precisely when he demanded action. Patton's fatal car accident on December 9, 1945, and his subsequent death on December 21, 1945, became the subject of rumor as well as official record. The documented facts are sobering. A traffic collision left him gravely injured. He lingered in a medical ward and then died of pulmonary edema and heart failure. For some, the timing, after his final, pointed assessments of Soviet intentions, fed suspicion and dramatic counter-narratives. For historians, the medical record, witness testimony, and subsequent archival work leave the death explained by accident and illness. For the public imagination, the loss of such a combative voice at a pivotal moment ensured his place as a martyr of contested policy. Across occupied Europe, soldiers and civilians remembered encounters with Soviet troops in ways that reinforced Patton's warnings. Stories of requisitions, political arrests, and heavy-handed security patrols were common in liberated towns. Those local memories fed political currents back home, especially among émigré communities and veterans groups. Over time, these voices helped seed public support for policies that would isolate Soviet influence and support free institutions in Europe. Patton's field observations thus found new life in a broader popular memory that underwrote Cold War policies even when the precise tactical options of 1945 remained closed. History tends to ask blunt questions in soft voices. Who was right then, and what did the world pay for the choice made? Patton warned that ground possession would translate to political control. Politicians chose negotiation and containment over immediate military risk. The Cold War that followed proved some aspects of his strategic thesis, that the Soviet Union would use force to secure influence, but it also validated the politicians' dread. A direct clash with the Red Army might have been catastrophic. In the end, Patton's legacy is dual: a soldier's clear-eyed warning about how power is imposed on the map, and a cautionary lesson about the limits of military solutions in a world bound together by fragile diplomacy. The film closes not with an answer, but with the image of a map, a pencil, and a name. A reminder that the hardest choices of 1945 shaped the next half-century. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more.